Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Lenore Black, and today I'm going to be covering the murder of Lynne Harper, or most commonly known as the Steven Truscott story. So just to briefly describe what exactly I'm covering is that this is a case that happened in 1959 in Clinton, Ontario, and it was a highly publicized, sensationalized case that had happened in Canada. And ultimately, a 14-year-old boy was sentenced to death for the murder of a 12-year-old girl. So it is known to be a very, very extreme case that has happened in Canada, because it's kind of like, it's been known as being the most famous bike ride in Canadian history. And it's also a case that has made Canada really look objectively on the criminal justice system and saying, we need to change something here. We need to do something different. So first things first, who is Steven Truscott? Steven Truscott was born January 18th, 1945 in Vancouver, British Columbia. His parents were Dan Truscott and Doris Truscott, and Dan Truscott was a warrant officer for the Royal Canadian Air Force, and his mother, Doris, was a housewife. They had 4 children: Ken, Stephen, Bill, and Barbara. Ken was the oldest, Stephen was the second oldest, and Bill and Barbara were their younger siblings. Dan was actually really well known for being a family man and very good with kids. So Stephen was known as very athletic. He was a jock. He was very attractive to the other girls his age at that time. He was the star of the team and was good at everything that he put his mind to. He was a handsome 14-year-old boy with light brown hair and hazel eyes. And at the time, he was also 5'8" and a half. And so he stood at like the back of the class photo, towering over everybody because he was so tall. But a good thing I did learn about Steven is that he was, all of his classmates and his friends, they actually felt really safe being around him. Very kind and polite. He wasn't a bully. At least that's what is based on what his classmates have said. I've never met him. So now we move on to Lynne Harper. Who is Lynne Harper? Lynne Harper was born as Cheryl Lynne Harper on August 31st, 1946. And everyone just called her by her middle name because that's what she preferred. She was born in Moncton, New Brunswick. Excuse me if I've said that name wrong. Her father, Leslie Harper, was a flying officer and was previously a teacher before joining the Royal Canadian Air Force in 1940. Her mother, Shirley, was a housewife. Although they were living in Moncton, New Brunswick, they relocated to the Clinton Air Force Base in 1957 in July. And that's where he was working. They had 3 children. Barry was the oldest, Lynn was the second oldest, and their younger brother, Jeffrey. Lynn was a good student. She was involved in Girl Guides, she was going to Sunday school and involved in Bible studies, and she was involved in a lot of extracurriculars. She was also an avid organizer. Lynn was actually also a chatterbox. Like, she talked a lot, and she's one of those kids in class that was like, pick me, like, because she always had the answer for everything. She was just very intelligent. At the time, she was 5'3", 100 pounds, probably soaking wet because she looks very, very small in her pictures. And she was excited to be turning 13 in 2 months. Lynn also had a scar on her face. She had a hair lip at birth, so it was fixed, but she was very self-conscious about it, and she was not a popular girl. She was kind of like an outcast and was always eager to make friends and try to fit in with her crowd at school. Lynn also had a sometime boyfriend, companion named George Archibald. But I'm going to be discussing him later on. So at the time that this incident happened, Stephen was 14 years old, and I would assume that because of Dan's position in the Royal Canadian Air Force, they relocated from Vancouver to Clinton, Ontario, to that military base because of Dan Truscott's job. In 1959, Clinton, Ontario was just known as a flat farmland. There was not really a lot there, and it's located in southwestern Ontario, which is about 3 hours away from Toronto. Clinton was a small rural area that had only about 2,600 residents, and it was a deeply religious community. This Royal Canadian Air Force Base had the largest radar and telecommunications training center in the entire country. So near this military base, there was actually a large farm called Bob Lawson's farm, and it was 150 acres of land, and it was known as a hangout for the kids to go to. And there was also a bush that was right in the middle of the main county road through Clinton, and it was Lawson's bush, which is where the crime had taken place. This bush was also a huge hangout for the kids as well, because let's face it, at the time, like, there was not a lot of things to do, and so the kids just hung out on farm properties or bushes or whatever. There was also a store called the Red and White candy store. I should also say that another common area of hangout was the school. A lot of the kids hung out at the school together. They didn't have iPads, they didn't have computers, they didn't have smartphones, they just had the great outdoors, which is personally my favorite choice. So on June 5th, 1959, Steven and Lynn were both invited to Lorraine Wood's house, which was a classmate of theirs at their school, and this was 6 days before the murder took place. So because Steven was 14 and Lynn was almost 13, they were actually in a split class together at their school, and this is what made Lynn want to engage more with the older students. And being 13, this is the age where she was starting to get interested in boys and wanted to be around boys more. Lynn had a schoolgirl crush, or a puppy love crush, on Steven, and Steven knew this because his friends picked on him for it. And during this party, Lynn asked Steven to dance with her, and being the kind of kid that Steven was, and he didn't want to be rude, he was a polite kid, he accepted. Steven actually didn't take a liking to Lynn all that much because he thought that she followed him around a lot. This is just something to keep in mind as we continue on with our story. Because these kids were military kids, they didn't really get to keep friendships for very long because they were constantly moving across the country all the time. So, back to the Bob Lawson farm. Steven was really close friends with Bob Lawson, who at only 22 years of age was owning and running this farm. I can't imagine being 22 years old in this day and age, managing and owning and running my own farm. Even if it was in my blood. Because Steven and Bob Lawson were good friends, Steven constantly went over to the farm and helped out with the farm chores. They were such close friends that Bob Lawson actually let Steven ride his Ferguson tractor after he first bought it. And together they were actually restoring a 1929 Ford Model A car. So that weekend of June 5th, 6th, and 7th, you know, after the party and everything, Steven finished his chores at Lawson's farm, and he spent the rest of his time just hanging out at the base with his friends, going to the swimming hole to fish even, or he plays sports. So before I continue this story, I need to explain to you how exactly the Clinton Air Force Base was set up. So I did a brief sketch here, and honestly, it's not fit to scale. It's just how I remember the Air Force Base looking like, and I've kind of used a reference on the computer because I don't have a printer to print off the map. But this is what it looked like. From far away, it's kind of hard to see. So this is the school down here. This is where the base line is. And this is the main county road. So this is Bob Lawson's farm right here. This is Lawson's bush. here. And then this is the bridge that's just past the Canadian National Railway. And up here is highway number 8. So these are all important facts to know as I continue with the story. So that weekend, Lynn went to Girl Guides and she had a fight with her friend Andrea Buck because Andrea had told their classmates that Lynn had a crush on Steven, so Lynn was extremely embarrassed over this. And at that Girl Guide meeting, Lynn received a red hairband, which is something to pay close attention to as we continue. So let me describe the school atmosphere now, because this is something that is important. Knowing the kind of girl that Lin Harper was, you know, somebody who was very eager to impress people and do her best in extracurriculars, Lynn sat at the front of the class, right beside the teacher's desk. So she was, I guess you could say, a teacher's pet a little bit. Steven sat at the back of the class at the right-hand side near the windows so he could look outside. Steven sat near 2 major players that we're going to be talking about in this story. Beside him was one of his good friends named Arnold George, also known as Butch. Butch was known as a brawler. He was known as kind of a meanie and a ruffian, smart mouth. Steven mentioned that he was friends with Butch at this time because he enjoyed Butch's company and there was never a dull moment with Butch. He was a daring individual. Butch's father was also a Army man and he was well known in the Air Force community. So 3 seats away from Steven was another classmate named Jocelyn Goddard. Jocelyn was either friends or close acquaintances with Lynn, and she was known to kind of be an outcast as too. She was picked on a lot, teased by the other girls for her acne. She was also loud, obnoxious, annoying, and she was a know-it-all. People don't like know-it-alls. Both of these classmates had reputations for being untrustworthy, constantly lying, or fabricating stories. So now we're getting right down to it. June 9th, 1959. On that day, Steven and Lynn finished school for the day and both played separate baseball games. Lynn's team won against Goderich, and from there, her 4th grade teacher Helen Blair drove her home from the baseball game, and she arrived at approximately 5:30 according to Shirley Harper. Lynn ate dinner, scoffed it down in 15 minutes, and at 5:45 told her mother that she really wanted to go to the community pool to go swimming. Because Lynn was only 12 years old at the time, the pool regulations were that she needed to be accompanied by a parent. So when she went to the base official's office to get a permit, they denied her because she wasn't with her mother. So when she returned home, she was angry and they got into a fight. So when Lynn returned from the base official after being denied a swimming pass because her mother would not come with her and they had their fight, she washed the dishes for 20 minutes and then she handled her neighbor's baby who was talking to her mother in the backyard before she left the house at 6:15. While Shirley was in the backyard talking to the neighbor, Leslie Harper was in the living room, and when Lynn left, she didn't tell anyone where she was going and nobody asked. Lynn left the house wearing brown loafers, turquoise shorts, and a sleeveless white blouse. And Lynn also had this locket with the Royal Canadian Air Force crest on it in a heart made of plexiglass, and it was given to her as a gift from her aunt 3 weeks prior. Now we go to Steven. Steven arrived home from baseball at 5:15 and he was fooling around in his front yard until about 5:50, and then his mother Doris came out and asked if he would run to the store for her to pick up some coffee, and he did. When he returned shortly after, he had mentioned that he had gotten a rip in the seat of his pants from riding his brother Bill's bike. And afterwards, he ate dinner and he left home. Steven knew that he had to be back by 8:30 because his parents weren't home and Ken had plans to go out that evening, so Steven had to return by 8:30 to watch his brother Bill and his sister Barbara at home. Steven left his house at the exact same time that Lynne Harper left her house, which was 6:15 p.m. Steven roamed around the base on his bike because his bike was his most prized possession. Steven crossed paths with his friend Gord Logan, and Gord asked him at this point if he was going to the watering hole to go swimming, and Steven replied, maybe later. Several patrons distinctly remember seeing Steven biking at the base at 6:30, and they also remember him biking on the county road up to the watering hole, passing Lawson's Bush several times. At 6:15, Lynn was leaving her house and heading towards the school playground, and what was only supposed to be a 5-minute walk actually ended up being a 20-minute walk because she detoured and went through a grove of trees. What's strange about this is that the police and the prosecution that later handled this case never once questioned or were curious as to these 15 unaccounted minutes that Lynn was walking. And to this day, still nobody knows about it. Personally, I think she just wanted a change in scenery. I think she just wanted to walk somewhere nice and not think about what was bothering her. She arrived at the playground at 6:35. So when she got to the school, she met up with Ann Nickerson, who is a 32-year-old brown owl. So for those of you that are not familiar with Girl Guides, it is the Canadian version of the Scouts. So brown owl is a name for the leader of the brownie group. So the way that the Girl Guides go is you start off as a spark. So you dress in pink and you're in sparks until a certain age. And then you graduate to brownies, and brownies wear brown, and they, again, a certain age. And then after brownies comes Girl Guides, which are blue. And then after Girl Guides is Pathfinders, which are green. So there's an age that you are, when you join the Girl Guides, you are dictated into a group based on your age. So because Ann Nickerson was a brownie leader, she was creating a scavenger hunt for these girls, and Lynn wanted to help in splitting the girls into different groups for this scavenger hunt. When the girls split up into their groups to do the scavenger hunt, Lynn and Ann talked under a tree for about 20 minutes. And Lynn had mentioned to her that she didn't want to go home because she'd gone into an argument with her mother. Shortly after this, Steven arrived on his bike nearby. Steven was wearing brown leather scruffy shoes, red pants, red jeans more so, and he was also wearing a white shirt with laces in the collar. What Anne describes is she actually sees Lynn approaching Steven's bike, and Lynn is doing most of the talking at this point. Lynn asked Steven for a ride to Highway 8 because he was already going to be taking a ride down there to the swimming hole to see his friends. This moment, this tiny moment in time, would change their lives forever and would definitely change Canadian history. So mothers of these Girl Guides that were in the area mentioned to the police that the last time that they saw Lynn and Steven in that area was between 7 and 7:10 p.m. Because Steven and Lynn were on the playground at this point, they had to walk around the school before they started biking up towards Highway 8. And when they walked around the school, Steven peered into a classroom, glanced up at the clock, and saw that the time was 7:25. There was also several kids that were still playing baseball in the area, and they all gave different times of when they saw the two of them together, between 7 and 7:30. So there wasn't really a lot of accountability there. At this time, Lynn then hopped up on the armbar of Steven's bike, Green Racer. While Steven was biking Lynn on the county road towards Highway 8, he remembers that she had mentioned she got into a fight with her mother because her mother would not let her go swimming. And she was contemplating visiting the small white house with ponies that was owned by Edgar Hodges at the end of the road on the highway. Edgar Hodges' farm of ponies was actually another place that the kids liked to hang out because he welcomed the kids to come and pet the ponies whenever they wanted. God, that sounds awful. At 7:25, Lynn and Steven were on their way down the county road towards Highway 8, and Just before they were heading towards the Lawson's bush, they passed Richard Gallatley, which was another classmate of theirs, and he was heading back towards the military base to his home. And he was only about 5 minutes away, and this is confirmed by his father when he arrived back at his house. This occurrence happened between the O'Brien farm and the Lawson farm, so that would have been around this area before they even approached the bush. After this point, the story splits in two. Prosecutors argued that Steven detoured into the Lawson bush where he strangled, raped, and killed Lynne Harper. But Steven is stating that he never detoured into the bush and he continued on towards Highway 8. Now, another classmate of theirs was named Dougie Oates. Such a cute name. He was 11 years old. Dougie, as cute as that is, his name, at this time, he was at the swimming hole, which was under the bridge past Lawson's bush, catching turtles. So cute. Doug Oates left his house at 6 p.m. and he kind of rerouted and detoured a little bit. He was watching two cardinals at one point before he finally made his way to the bridge, or the swimming hole. Dougie Oates distinctly remembers that afternoon because the one thing that he can remember is Steven and Lynn doubling across the bridge together passing within a few feet of each other. Gord Logan, who Steven had briefly talked to earlier, was also at that watering hole at this time, and he also distinctly remembers seeing Lynn and Steven doubling across the bridge as well. Gord recalls that this was at 7:30 p.m. When Steven was crossing the bridge, he says he remembers waving to Butch George because Butch George was apparently there. Butch George originally told the police this as well, that he had saw Steven and waved to him at the river, but then later recanted his statement saying that he didn't see them biking north. Steven pedaled the remaining 1,300 feet from the bridge to the end of the county road where he dropped Lynn off at Highway 8, and it was a very short exchange from there. Lynn didn't mention to Steven where she was going. He didn't really ask. All she mentioned was the ponies. Steven returned to the bridge 5 minutes later, and as he was approaching the bridge, he turned around to check the traffic to make sure it was safe to cross the road, and he saw Lynn at the corner of Highway 8 getting into a gray 1959 Chevy. It was going eastbound towards Stratford. Yes, Stratford, where Justin Bieber came from. Steven could distinguish the type of car that it was because it was the brand new Chevy model that year, and it had wings out the back and cat-eye taillights. He also mentioned something else that was very strange. He said there was something yellow or orange on the back bumper of the car. He wasn't sure if it was a license plate or if it was a sticker. Now, there is a number of provinces that actually have yellow or orange in their license plate. For instance, Quebec, their plates were black on yellow at this point. Nova Scotia had light yellow plates. Manitoba had yellow on black plates. And 3 states that were bordering Ontario at that point all had some yellow in their plates. So really, there was a lot of different reasons as to why he saw yellow or orange. Dougie Oates had an older brother named Alan, and Alan was 16, and he recalls seeing Steven at the bridge at 7:45. Alan was walking on the Canadian Railway when he noticed Steven at the bridge, and he saw that Steven was there for approximately 5 to 10 minutes, didn't acknowledge any kids, before he turned back and pedaled to the base. All the witnesses maintain their stories to this day. So I'll kind of take a detour and talk to you about what happened with Butch George this day, because, like I said, he is a major player in this story. Butch claims that after he mowed the lawn at his house, at 6:30 he went over to Steven's house to look for him. When he found out that Steven wasn't home at that time, he started walking down the county road and he actually met up with Jocelyn Goddard. Or is it pronounced Goslyn Gooday? Sound familiar? Butch found Jocelyn at the entrance to the Lawson's bush, and when he saw her, she said that she was looking for them too. Jocelyn, she claimed that Steven and her had a date to go look for calves in the Lawson's bush, but that she wasn't supposed to tell anybody about it. It was a secret. This is what she later told police. So Jocelyn and Butch had a short exchange, and Butch basically asked her, have you seen Steven? And she said no. Have you seen Lynn? And he said no, but if I do see her, I'll let you know that you're looking for her. And she said okay. Philip Burns, who is also a classmate of theirs, actually saw this brief conversation as well. So he was kind of caught up in between because he was on the county road at that time as well. The two then proceeded separately to the bridge, and Jocelyn stated that she got there within 10 minutes, and Butch completely backs up this story. Jocelyn said that this exchange happened shortly after 6:30, but Butch actually said that this exchange happened well after 7. Steven arrived back at the school by 8 p.m. and when people saw him, his classmates, patrons in the area, they all described that he was normal. Nothing really changed about him. He didn't have cuts, scratches, bruises, nothing on his person looked disheveled. Steven arrived back in time to babysit, and he told his mother that he was basically just riding up and down the county road to the bridge and hanging out at the school with his friends. So by 8:20, Butch and Galatly and another friend of theirs named Kenny Grieger, did I say that right? They bike back to the base from the river, and at this point, Butch is already stirring up stories about Steven and Lynn. It doesn't look good. At 8:45, Butch arrived at Steven's house, and Butch claimed to the police that Steven and him never talked about Lynn, but later he changed his story that they actually did. During this conversation, apparently Steven had told Butch that he and Lynn went into the woods looking for calves together, and Steven is saying that this conversation never happened. You see, Butch can't keep his story straight. Like, he's saying one thing and then he's saying another to the police, and it is just so frustrating. No one took Butch seriously. There were 7 boys in Steven's class that were told 3 different stories by Butch. Lynn's curfew was 9 p.m. So when Lynn didn't arrive home at 9:15, Shirley Harper started getting really worried about where her daughter could be. So she called on her son Barry, which was Lynn's older brother, to go out and search for her. And shortly after that, Leslie Harper joined in that search. At 10:30, George Archibald, which I mentioned previously is Lynn's ex-boyfriend, or I don't even know. He arrived looking for Lynn because she promised that she was gonna lend him her sleeping bag. But Shirley told George, I'm sorry, but Lynn's not home. We don't know where she is. At 11:20, Shirley gets really worried, so she goes over to her neighbor and calls on Flight Sergeant Frank Johnson. He was the non-commissioned officer that was in charge of the Air Force Police. He notified the police, and the Ontario Provincial Police were also notified to keep a lookout for her. At 11:25, Corporal William A. Webb was on duty at the Royal Canadian Air Force Guardhouse, and he was notified by Lynn's father that she was missing and she hasn't been home. Corporal Webb then called the Ontario Provincial Police, a detachment that was closest to his base, and notified them of her disappearance at 11:30. At 11:40, an officer went over by the community pool thinking that Lynn was probably over there, maybe wanting to go for a swim, and he found that she wasn't there. In the span of 15 minutes, 3 OPP and Air Force officers concluded in 3 separate reports that Lynn was a runaway. Lynn's mother testified later in court saying that Lynn was not a girl to hitchhike, but several of Lynn's friends insisted that this wasn't true, and they were never called to testify. 7 counties were notified, and Lynn's parents left on the porch lights all night long, awaiting their daughter to return home. Now we're going on to June 10th, 1959, the day after Lynn disappeared. June 10th was actually a half day at the school, and the kids were let out after lunch for a fair that was being held. Leslie Harper went to visit one of Lynn's friends' fathers named Gary Hoyer, and this is where she learned that Lynn and Steven had been together before she went missing. So from there, she started heading towards the Truscott residence, and she actually crossed paths with Dan Truscott in the meantime. Shirley Harper asks Dan Truscott if it was okay if she could question Steven as to the whereabouts of where her daughter could be, and Dan Truscott allows her to do so. Shirley asks Steven Truscott about his last interaction with her daughter Lynn, and Steven admitted that he had given Lynn a ride to Highway 8 where she hitchhiked into town. There was actually speculation that because Lynn and her mother had gotten into an argument, Lynn was hitchhiking to get to her grandmother's house. At this point in time, a search was not deemed to be necessary because the officers had more other important things to tend to, so they didn't want to waste their time looking for a runaway. The following morning, Officer Donald Hobbs came to Steven and Lynn's school to question Steven because Leslie Harper had notified him that his daughter Lynn had still not returned home. They picked up Dan Truscott, and then they also picked up Flight Sergeant Frank Johnson, who is the Harper's neighbor, to go and get Steven excused from school. When Steven got outside, he saw the cruiser and he got in the front seat. Steven tells Officer Hobbs what he told Shirley Harper, that he dropped Lynn off at Highway 8 where she hitchhiked. He also mentioned that Lynn also was talking about possibly visiting Edgar Hodges' pony farm. Lynn had mentioned to him that she needed to be home by 8 or 8:30. Steven also mentions that the Chevy was possibly a Bel Air and that it appeared to have a yellow plate on the back, and that he was not sure how many people were in the front seat, but he knew that there was nobody in the back seat. This is a problem because in 1959, if you said it appeared or it was possible, the cops automatically marked that as it happened. Hobbs then said that he had another matter to attend to, so the interview with Steven was cut short and he had to return to class. Frank Johnson then went to Edgar Hodges' pony farm and he asked Edgar if he had seen Lynn within the last day. And Edgar admitted that he knew who Lynn was, but that he hadn't seen her the previous night. During recess, Steven went out and he was questioned by a lot of his peers about Lynn and what exactly was happening. There was another kid that was on the playground named Tom Gillette, and he testified in court later on that he overheard Steven talking to his peers saying that he heard a calf in Lawson's bush and went in to investigate. So this is something that could be used against Steven. There was another girl in their class named Joyce Harrington, and she testified that she overheard Butch tell a relative of his named Mike George, "Did you hear that Lynn was raped?" How does this kid know that this girl has even been raped before the body is even discovered? Could Steven have told Butch that he did this? Is Butch cooking up more lies? Or was Butch the one that was involved in this? Steven went home for lunch and he was faced with a second interview for 3 hours by Constable Donald Trumbley. Remember this name. Steven mentions a little bit more about the car. He said that the tires were white-walled tires. He also said that there was a lot of chrome and yellow markers on the car. At 4 p.m., Trumbley decided to test Steven's theory, went to the bridge and tried to distinguish plates on cars to see if he could read their numbers. This test actually also gave Trumbley doubts about Steven's story. But let me just mention one thing. Steven never said that he saw any license plate numbers, just the plate color. Later that afternoon, Steven went swimming at the watering hole with his friends, and what they recollect is that they didn't see any scars, scratches, cuts of any kind. So they didn't really have reason to believe that he was involved in this. At 5 p.m., Officer Trumbley went to the Truscott home and he asked Shirley Truscott and Steven to both accompany him to the bridge so that Steven could show him where he stood when he saw Lin Harper getting into the Chevy. When Steven got there, he stood 10 feet north of the bridge and said, "This is where I stood when I saw the car." And Trumbley, of course, was like, "But Steven, from here you can't see the plates. How the hell could you have seen a plate from here?" Also at 5 p.m., Butch claims that he went to visit Steven at his home, which is impossible if he was seeing Officer Trumbley at this time. But later in court, Butch changed it to 6 p.m. to be more convenient. Butch claimed that Steven mistakenly told police that he saw him at the bridge, but really he saw Gord Logan, and he offered to lie to police for Steven to cover for him. Steven says this conversation never happened. At this point in time, Steven hadn't even been questioned who he had seen at the bridge that day, and he had been interviewed 4 times, so why would it matter? That night, Steve, Butch, and 3 other friends of theirs went to the river, and when they got there, they asked Steven about what happened with him and Lynn in the bush. And Steven, again, denied that he had gone into the bush with Lynn, and he actually confronted Butch saying, "Stop spreading these rumors about me, this didn't happen." Which, of course, Butch is like, "I didn't say anything, I don't know what you're talking about." All of these joking words about Steven and Lynn in the bush were no longer joking words when the police got a hold of it. They took these allegations seriously. At 8 p.m., Sergeant Charles Anderson, who was the senior officer of the Goderich OPP detachment, arrived at the Truscott home. The officer asked Steven to show him his route that he took with Lynn before she disappeared. So Steven showed Sergeant Anderson his bike route that he took with Lynn when they pedaled up to the highway, and the questions that she asked him, which were, "Do you know about the man with the ponies at the end of the highway? And where do you fish?" And Sergeant Anderson did ask Steven, "Do the kids normally hitchhike?" And Steven said, "Yes, they do." Why would anyone feel in danger when they live near a military base? That evening, search parties were put together by the Air Force, and they searched abandoned houses, they searched swimming areas. They also checked either side of the county road that led up to Highway 8, but there was no sign of her anywhere. The next morning, on Thursday, Steven again is pulled out of class for a 5th interview. Steven was questioned by Constable Hobbs again, as well as Air Force Police and a Sergeant John Weedhouse. The officers set up shop in the teacher's lounge at the school, and this was a way for them to question each individual classmate that Steven and Lynn had to try to construct a story. In this interview, Steven mentions to Hobbs that he remembers Lynn discussing with him her new locket that she got from her aunt with the RCAF crest on it and the heart in plexiglass. So this is the first time that Hobbs has ever even heard of this locket. Steven again reports to Hobbs that he had passed Galatly and Butch at the river. So this is Thursday morning that Steven is mentioning this, not Wednesday as Butch says. He also mentions to Hobbs that he did remember seeing a Dodge or a Plymouth vehicle passing them on the county road, and he even remembers the license plate. 981666. And in the front seat was a lady and a man. I don't know about you, but I don't remember things like that at all. I do not take down license plates. I just don't. That's why this is kind of weird. I find this to be really strange because why would you take note of a license plate on a car that you're passing on some random afternoon? I don't know, it's weird to me. Steven also mentions that he remembers seeing 4 people at the river. Dougie Oates, Gord Logan, Daryl Girks, and the last one was Jerry Durnan. When Steven was asked again when he left with Lynn on his bike, he said 7 o'clock or shortly after, which he previously stated that it was 7:25. Steven seemed to get confused when it came to the times that it took to actually bike to the highway. He mentions that it took 10 minutes to bike to the bridge, and from the bridge it took another 10 minutes to bike to the highway, but that it only took another 5 minutes to bike back to the bridge, rather than 10 minutes. Steven's demeanor was forthright, He wasn't nervous. He was open and honest and wanted to help the police as best he could. Gord Logan is still adamant that he saw Steven and Lynne cross the bridge together, and he also returned afterwards and was lingering at the bridge. Gord Logan's mother even said, "Why would a boy lie about this when a body hasn't even been discovered yet?" Gallatley was also questioned, and he insists that he also saw Steven and Lynne pass him at 7:30. Butch told the police on Thursday morning that he did see Steven and Lynne biking north towards the highway, but later when he became the prosecutor's star witness, he retracted his statement. Later that afternoon in the boys' bathroom, Steven and Alan Durnan, who is Gary Durnan's brother, had a conversation. He told Steven that he didn't think that Steven gave her a ride because Steven wouldn't be caught dead with somebody as simple and young as Lynne, knowing that Steven was a star athlete. Dougie Oates was in the washroom as well at this point, and he witnessed Steven get very angry and push Alan up against a wall before a teacher came in and broke up the altercation. Obviously by this point, Steven was just embarrassed and annoyed and through the taunting from his classmates. By that Thursday afternoon, Lynne's body was found. Thursday morning was June 11th, 1959. This was the day that Lin Harper was found. There was 250 officers and they had split into 3 search parties. One searched the river, one searched the highway, and one searched the woods. The airmen and George Edens were all searching this area for about a half an hour when George Edens realized that in the underbrush there was these 2 loafers that were aligned together, and one loafer was on its side. Shortly after finding the loafers, Eden continued searching and he found that there was a neat pile of clothes nearby, and he thought to himself, why would a little girl be out here naked? As they were continuing through the brush, they finally found Lynne's body in a shallow grave. It was 6 feet long and 15 inches deep. Her body was found 83 feet from the tractor trail and 280 feet from the main county road. As I continue on with this, I'm going to be explaining the manner of how Lynne's body was found, and I'm warning you now that it is a very disturbing scene that the officers did find. It was hard for me to read this. I just want to tell you that viewer discretion is advised. If you are sensitive to this content, I will leave a timestamp here to show you when it is safe to continue watching. Lynne was lying on her back and she had a white undershirt that was pulled up towards her chest and it was smeared with blood. The white sleeveless blouse that Lynne had been wearing that day was used to strangle her, and her face and her body were swollen. Because of the heat and the environment that Lynne's body was in, decomposition was already starting to take place. The brutality of Lynne's murder was so horrific and she was raped so violently that the airmen wanted to protect her dignity. And when they did this, they compromised the crime scene and destroyed potential evidence. So from the beginning of this case, it had little legs to walk on. The Ontario Provincial Police arrived to the scene at 2:08 p.m. By this point, Constable Donald Trumbull started arriving to the scene, and with him he brought Corporal Hank Sayu. Hank Sayu had only seen 2 previous murders in his career, and they were both from domestic disputes that happened in the Huron County, which was about 10 minutes away from Clinton. From here, the airmen sectioned off the woods to limit spectators and the media from getting in. At 2:35, Dr. Fred Thompson arrived to the scene, and he was the coroner that was taking over the case. And when he got there, he had to wait for a pathologist to show up who was coming from Stratford. Dr. David Hall Brooks also arrived on scene, and he is the senior medical officer at the base. And he was able to determine it was Lynne's body because he lived across the street from the Harpers, and his daughter, who was in Girl Guides, had Lynne as her patrol leader. So he was well aware of who Lynne was. Shirley and Leslie Harper were then notified that they had found their daughter deceased. Corporal John Erskine was also on the scene at this time, and he was the district identification officer for the Ontario Provincial Police, and he was there also to catalog information at the scene. He took note of Lynn's white blouse, turquoise shorts, and white socks, but he also took note of the red hairband that she had received from her Girl Guide meeting the previous weekend. Her locket was also found hanging from a barbed wire fence that was surrounding the perimeter of the Lawson's bush. The earth was also undisturbed around Lynn's body, almost as if she was placed there in a peaceful manner. There were no clumps of dirt, there was no broken branches or sticks. There was nothing to suggest that there was a violent struggle that had happened in Lawson's bush. Her socks, strangely enough, were rolled up, and there were no rips or tears in her underwear or her turquoise shorts, and the shorts were zipped up. Her neck was not broken, but she did have a large wound on the back of her left shoulder and strangulation marks. 2 branches were also laying across her body, and they were placed in a way that they were framing her face in a V shape. There were no fingerprints. I mean, come on, it's 1959. They didn't have the technology that we do now. At 4:45, Dr. John Llewellyn arrived to the scene, and he is the pathologist that has come from Stratford. He noticed that there was blood on the front seam of her shorts, and what he also noticed was that there was blood on dandelion leaves from after her body was moved, and no hair or fibers were collected. At 4:48, it was also documented that Lynn had these strange scrapes on the bottoms of her feet. So one was 10 inches long and one was 11 inches long, and at most these scrapes were maybe 1/4 of an inch deep. Officer Glenn Sage did notice that there was a shoe print that was about 2 to 3 inches from Lynn's left heel. And what they determined was it could possibly be from a crepe shoe that has wavy lines on the bottom. An hour later, Dr. Llewellyn finished collecting evidence, and this was at 5:45. Corporal George Edens also found something very interesting when he was walking along the tractor trail that was leading into the Lawson's bush. He found fresh tire skid marks, but he also found week-old bicycle tracks. What they found strange about this was that the tire tracks eventually got deeper as they approached the county road, which this would mean that somebody spun their tires out as their front tires had touched the county road and then they gunned it out. This was the last mention of the tire tracks, unfortunately. Now, there was an inspector that was hired by the OPP named Harold Graham, and he was part of the Criminal Investigations Branch. In 1973, Harold Graham actually became the commissioner of the OPP because of the fame he received from the Truscott case. He wrapped up this case in 24 hours. How is that even possible? On June 11th, 1959, at 7:45, he arrived to the site, and he was caught up with what was going on at the scene by Trumbley, Anderson, and Sayu. The OPP then issued a general information broadcast about what had happened to Lynn, and there was 3 major things that they had mentioned in this broadcast. The first thing that was noted in the bulletin was the 1959 Chevy that Steven claimed had picked up Lynn at the end of the county road. And it also mentioned that it was white or gray, had yellow or orange markings on it, and that it was possibly a Bel Air. And the police at that time were stopping any car of this description. The second thing that was noted in the bulletin was that Lynn's attacker most likely had scratches on their hands, arms, face, because the struggle was so violent. And it was also mentioned that the pathologist had taken Lynn's fingernail clippings. The third and last thing that was mentioned in the bulletin was that Lynn was killed at 9 p.m. on Tuesday, June 10th, 1959. This part of the bulletin was actually interesting because Tuesday, June 10th was actually Tuesday, June 9th. And if the murder happened at 9 o'clock at night, then Steven's name would be cleared because he was home babysitting by that point. And what's also really interesting about this bulletin is that it disappeared for 4 decades and it was found in the late 1990s. How do you lose a bulletin about important information like this? Like, I don't know how you lose a bulletin. Once Steven was arrested, this bulletin disappeared and the prosecutors never let the defense see it or the jury see it. I'm going to be talking about the autopsy now, and again, be warned that this is very graphic content that I'm going to be explaining. I will put another timestamp at the bottom to tell you when it is safe to continue watching, because this is really graphic. In an autopsy that was done by Dr. Llewellyn and Dr. Brooks, they determined and confirmed that her cause of death was strangulation by ligature, the ligature being her own blouse. They also mentioned that there was no injury to the scalp, but there was a rugged laceration on the back of her left shoulder. Lynne had many scratches on her legs and arms and torso from being carried over the barbed wire fence. They also mentioned that it was a blind, violent rape and that the vagina was grossly bruised and that her hymen was destroyed. So it was bad. And the last thing that was mentioned was there was no semen found. The contents of Lynne's stomach helped the pathologist determine Lynne's time of death. So because this is 1959, I'm seriously, I'm not joking when I say this. They took her stomach contents and they poured it into a glass jar and they held it up to the light and they visually inspected it to determine how digested it was to figure out her time of death. I really wish I was making this up. They deducted the time of death purely on the basis of objective science. A visual examination of the stomach contents helped the pathologist determine Lynne's time of death, which was between 7:15 p.m. and 7:45 p.m. on June 9th, 1959. What a coincidence. What people don't understand is that pathology is the study of how someone died. It is not meant to determine and pinpoint the time in which somebody dies. A time of death can be determined by the influence of the circumstances, but rarely pinpointed. And the reason for this is because there are so many variables that have to be considered because everyone is different. Some people digest faster than others. Some people digest slower than others. And also, environmental factors have to be considered in a death. Ontario Attorney General Kelso Roberts then put up a bulletin offering $10,000 to find Lynne's killer. And I actually calculated that today that would be worth $87,000. This reward was so hefty because they were really desperate to find this killer because the province was so shocked about the brutality of it. Now it is June 12th, 1959. At 10:45 a.m., Harold Graham goes to Steven's school and pulls him out of class for another interview. This will have been the 6th encounter he's had with the police in the last 3 days. Graham argued in court that at this time, Steven was not a suspect, he was just a witness. But according to police reports, there was already suspicions that Steven committed this crime. There was a stenographer that was in this encounter with Steven and Graham, and a stenographer is somebody that transcripts the conversation. Steven had mentioned he was 14 years old and that he had Lynne as a classmate and that they had known each other for 2 years. The stenographer was very vague in her transcripts, and because the questions that were asked of Steven were not recorded, it was very hard to distinguish whether or not Steven was certain with his facts. Steven retells the exact same story he's been telling this whole time, which is that he biked Lynne to the highway, she stuck her thumb out, a car pulled over, and she got into the front seat of a '59 Chevy. He admitted in this interview that he is interested in girls, but he was not interested in Lynne in that way. He also said that Lynne really wasn't the top pick of any of the boys at school because she kind of had a bossy demeanor. He also mentions that he waved to Dougie Oates just before he was pedaling back, which in earlier testimony he said that he waved to Butch George. when he was crossing the bridge. Steven stated that he saw 4 boys at the watering hole that Tuesday. One of them was Gary Gilks, but Steven testified earlier that it was actually Gary's brother Daryl. The police actually didn't write out the names properly. They were writing them by their last name, so it was hard for them to determine the kids when they were siblings, and so I think this is what caused confusion in the police reports, and they messed up the names somehow. Steven also mentioned in earlier police reports that Gary Durnan was there, but in fact he wasn't there. Again, Steven said he thought he saw Gary Durnan, and that, according to police, was definite. Harold Graham interviewed about a dozen other students that day, and again, Gord Logan and Dougie Oates were very, very adamant that they saw Steven and Lynn crossing the bridge together. Graham called these friends of his chums of the accused because he couldn't credit them as they were so young, and he thought that they were just trying to protect Steven. However, Graham believed Butch's story because Butch and Steven were still friends. And Graham's screwed up reasoning for this was because when Butch originally said that Steven didn't do it, only to later change his story after Lynn's body was found, was reason enough to believe that he was telling the truth. This wasn't true, because in the June 12th notes, Butch never mentioned anything about him confessing to this. It wasn't until Monday, June 15th, that he started spinning stories. Graham claims that he didn't think of Steven as being a suspect until he'd heard testimony from Jocelyn Goddard. Good day. I'm just gonna call her Jocelyn G from now on. This is when she told Harold Graham that her and Steven had a secret meeting to meet up in the Lawson's bush to see the newborn calves, and that she wasn't supposed to tell anybody about it. This is just one of the 3 statements she told police between June 12th and June 13th. So she can't keep her story straight, just like Butch. The first story that Jocelyn told was that she went looking in the bush for Lynn, where she was later found dead. Steven was not mentioned in this version at all. In the second statement, she told police that she was 13 years old in grade 7 and she went down the road at 6:30 to meet with Steven. She stated that they were supposed to meet at the southern tip of the Lawson's bush towards the school, but Steven did not show up. She then walked with her bicycle to the north end of the bush, where she turned into the laneway, walking towards where Lynn's body was discovered. She said she didn't hear any noises, she didn't see a bicycle, but she had a funny feeling. And then obviously the third story is this secret meeting with Steven in Lawson's bush. Not once until after Steven was arrested did Jocelyn even say anything to police about the whispers that were going on at the school or about these secret meetings to cover his tracks. And Graham took her testimony at face value. He never once even looked for adults to corroborate her story or anything. He just believed every single word she said. Once the pathologists examined Lynn's contents in her stomach, they determined that she was murdered no more than 2 hours after she ingested her dinner that night. Steven spent his last hours of liberty on the Lawson's farm. Officer Trumbley went to go pick up Steven on the orders of Harold Graham, and they didn't want his parents' knowledge of this happening. They brought Steven to the police station at 6:50, and he got into the police car willingly, didn't question anything, didn't ask about what his rights were. He just went willingly. He was seated in a back seat in the police station where they said they were gonna go over his statement again. And Steven thought that he was just gonna be signing his statement, but really what they wanted was a confession. Graham constructed a trap asking for Officer Anderson to go and obtain a search warrant to search Steven's home. And he told Dr. Brooks that he was doing this. He later boasted to everybody about how he went against the judge's guidelines to allow him to have a parent or guardian present, but he didn't want any parental interference involved in this. Back then, they had the Juvenile Delinquents Act, which made it that it was not against the law to question a minor without a parent or guardian present. But in today's society, we have something called the Youth Criminal Justice Act in Canada, and it is against the law now to question a minor without a parent or guardian present. They have the right. 3 months later at Steven's trial, the judge actually criticized Graham and the officers that brought Steven to the station because they didn't place him under arrest or even notify him that he was a suspect. If Steven wanted to leave at that point, he wouldn't have been allowed to leave, because when you're placed under arrest, you can't leave the station. But they didn't place him under arrest when technically they kind of did and just didn't tell them. So if he wanted to leave, he wouldn't have been able to leave. Steven finally signed the witness statement that the officers had gone through with him, and they changed the time that he returned to the school grounds on July 9th from 8 o'clock to 7:50 p.m. The police also questioned Steven if he had ever taken a girl into the Lawson's bush, and Steven said he'd never taken a girl into the Lawson's bush. Steven was also confused because the police asked when he had last talked to and visited Jocelyn, and Steven denied that he had any recent visits or phone conversations with her. They did the whole good cop, bad cop routine with him. So like they would have one cop come in and question him, and then that cop would leave, and then another one would come in and they would accuse him of lying the whole time. At 9:25, Harold Graham asked that the fellow officers bring Steven to the guardhouse and that they contact Dan Truscott to attend to the guardhouse to see his son. And 5 minutes later at 9:30, Doris was like very worried about her son. And so she went over to the Lawson farm to look for her son, but Bob Lawson said that Steven had left hours previously. When Dan Truscott got to the guardhouse, he was livid. He was pissed off because he was angry that they didn't notify him until it was that late and had questioned Steven without a parent or guardian present for so many hours. What parent wouldn't be angry about this? Harold Graham allowed Steven and Dan Truscott to talk privately, and when they did, Steven told his dad, you know, they're trying to pin this murder on me and they keep calling me a liar. And so Dan confronted Harold, saying that he was fabricating things to implicate that Steven was involved in this. So at this point in time, Graham asked Dan Truscott if he would have Steven looked over by a physician to see about cuts, scrapes, bruises, anything like that. And at first Dan Truscott was like, no, I'm not doing that. My son is fine, there's nothing on him, he didn't do this, he doesn't go out with girls. But when he asked his friend Charles Anderson, who is a constable, he said, what do you think? Should I have Steven looked over by a physician? And Anderson said, I would, because if you refuse to do so, it looks bad on both of you. At 10:35, a Dr. John Addison came to the guardhouse to do a thorough checkup on Steven, as he was the Truscott family physician. And by this point, Dr. Brooks, who was handling the case, had already debriefed him on the fact that Steven was the suspect of a rape investigation. Shortly before this examination took place, 3 officers arrived to the Truscott home claiming that they had a warrant to search the property. And Doris, you know, invited them in, saying, go ahead, look around, there's nothing that we're hiding here. Like, I don't understand why you needed a warrant for this. So when the police were there, they took bed linens, various pieces of clothing that Steven had. They took his brown shoes. They took underwear that he had been wearing the last couple of days. They took his bike. And they also took the red jeans that he had worn the day of the murder, which Doris had actually washed the following day afterwards. During the examination, Steven was extremely cooperative with Dr. Addison with his head-to-toe examination. And what the doctor concluded was that Steven had scrapes and scratches that were common for any 14-year-old boy to have. Upon examining the front of Steven's body, the physician noticed that Steven had 2 very sore quarter-size lesions on either side of his penis. And when they questioned Steven about it, he was extremely embarrassed to have to answer, but eventually he did admit that he had masturbated the week prior and it had been hurting for about 4 or 5 weeks. Dan Truscott then asked if Steven could be released around 1 a.m. because Steven was getting very tired during this entire interrogation, and the police would not allow that to happen. They said they weren't finished with him. And Dr. Addison, because he was still there, he said, you know, would you allow me to go and talk to Steven? Maybe he'll tell me something. And Harold Graham allowed him to question Steven, which is totally not at all okay. It's at this time that Dr. Addison does go in and talk to Steven about Lynn's disappearance, which Steven doesn't clearly recollect this conversation, but he does get asked what exactly they were talking about during their bike ride to Highway 8. What he does remember is he said she mentioned that she got a thistle either by the river or behind a bush, and that he remembers walking in the field but not with Lynn. He wasn't positive, but he thought that after coming back from dropping off Lynn, he did take a walk through the field. These are just the thoughts of a very exhausted teenager who is done with being questioned and interrogated by police that will not leave him alone. At 2:30 a.m., Steven would be told that he would be going to Goderich, and shortly after this, a judge would be putting out a warrant for his arrest for the killing of Lin Harper. And that is where I am going to stop. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. I really appreciate you watching. This is only part 1. I don't know how many parts of this I'm going to do because it's a very long story, but I do hope that you tune in to part 2, possibly part 3, we'll see. And thank you so much for watching. Take care.